Hi, my name's Peter. I've been doing a lot of work with action research over the last 10 or 15 years, and so this video is just to give you a bit of a brief overview about what it involves and what it might look like in practice. Action research is different from other research methodologies because it's about actually making change, and if you're in education, this is something that's been on my agenda for a long time, that when we do educational research, it's not just about finding out more about education, but it's about actually helping education be done better. So that's why I put this comment up here. We need to actively pursue the re-emphasis of educational research that places the interests of students, teachers and societies at the centre of the research process, because in terms of education, it's students and teachers that education is about, and particularly for students and their learning. And the only ones who can really make that happen are teachers. They're the ones who meet students in classrooms. So a lot of my work with action research has been trying to work with teachers doing action research in their own classrooms. That's why I like the quote at the bottom from Aristotle, which basically says we're not just doing this research just to find things out, we want to actually make things better. Now, action research has many forms. It's been around for, well, at least 80 years, and different forms and varieties of it are all variations that you might come across. Some of them are listed there. Participatory research, design-based research is where you are more deliberately trying to test something out and see how it works. Sometimes I've heard it called action learning, action science, classroom action research, all sorts of things. And they all have many things in common. But when I do action research, the form I do, I usually call critical participatory action research. Now, if you've ever read or seen stuff about action research, often it has this cycle. And what it means is often you start with some sort of plan, you go out and you do something, you collect some data, and then you come back and reflect on that data, and then you go on to the next cycle. The key thing here with action research is this cyclic nature is based on the fact that you don't actually plan the next cycle until you see what you found out in the first cycle. So you can't plan out 6 cycles of action research, for example. You only plan cycle 2 after you've finished cycle 1. Now this all looks nice and simple and makes sense, but really it's never that straightforward, and as always in educational research, it's more complex than you can imagine. But for a lot of people, this figure is the basis of action research. And what I'd like to suggest is it's a really useful way of planning an action research project, but just because you do cycles of inquiry doesn't mean you're necessarily doing action research. So just briefly, critical participatory action research is one where we try and actually change things, and we work in a collaborative way to improve a social practice. So for me, that's usually teaching, which therefore has a direct impact on learning. And what we want to do is find out what's actually happening in classrooms and learning environments so we can respond to those in an informed way and then try something else out. It's important that we collect the evidence, because although we often think we know what's going on, often what we see is different than what we might have perceived. So the 4 features of action research is, as I see it, and again this is a simplification, but the first thing is it's always about action. And in this case, with education research, the practices of education. Obviously action research is done a whole range of other places, but for us in education, action research is about the practice of education. It's not so much about the theory or the planning or anything like that, it's about the actual doing of it. The second thing is it's based on evidence. What actually is happening in classrooms or other learning situations? Now, I've been in lots of classrooms, both as a teacher and as an observer, and often what we think is often or can be different, even radically different from what actually is happening. So by using evidence, it gives us a chance to actually see what really is happening. The third thing is it's about development and change. We're not doing action research to just find out about something and describe it. We actively want to change it and then monitor that change on an ongoing basis. And the fourth thing I always say is it requires collaboration and working together. I'm not sure you can do action research by yourself. So the first of those points I made is about the practices of education. So mostly we're talking about learning as the central focus of education. Schools, TAFEs, universities, all those sorts of places, all their teaching happens because students are learning. And if students weren't there learning, then you don't need the teaching. So having learning and teaching as central is important, and also often the leading practices around it. But the teaching and the leading are only important really because of the way they impact learning. But when we consider these things, the action is not just what happens, it's also the conditions that shape those practices and what make things possible. If you've got action research where you're trying to develop some sort of changes, you often got to change the conditions that shape those practices as well, otherwise the changes are not sustainable. So for example, if you wanted to look at improving students' work with technology in classrooms, if you don't have the appropriate technology, you can't do it. So there's an associated change with conditions and practices. The other thing that's really important to note is action research is not about applying some sort of best practice. In fact, the nature of action research is based on the idea that there is no best practice. Best practice is only what is best practice in a particular site. There is no silver bullet that fixes education across all schools or other learning institutions. So we don't talk about best practice at all because we don't think it exists. The second thing is it's about evidence-based and finding actual data and evidence about what's happening. This means that the inquiry has to be systematic, but it has to be simple and focused on what's actually happening in the learning situation. It's not there to necessarily collect a whole pile of evidence to make a bulletproof case for some particular thing. It's about finding out what's going on. We use the word evidence rather than data. Not that there's anything wrong with data per se, but by evidence we mean looking at the situation like a historian or a journalist rather than necessarily a statistician. And the idea of the evidence is it enables you to develop and grow based on the realities of what's happening in that learning context. The third thing, and I've already mentioned this, but action research is about development and change. We're not trying to be neutral, we're not trying to come and just observe and note what's happening or describe it, we want to change it. And in this sense, it starts from the classroom out. So a lot of educational research, or a lot of educational development at least, starts with government and policy level, providing ideas and resources and then bringing them into the classroom. Whereas what this is saying is let's find out what's actually happening in the classroom and then work out from there. It's like the opposite way around, really. And we think this is important because that's actually where learning happens. By the time we have things imposed from outside, say a new curriculum, it comes from on high, it gets dumped on top, comes down, and by the time it gets to the classroom, it actually still has to be actioned in that classroom anyway. So what happens in the classroom out will be much more useful than necessarily providing something on top. So we think development based on action research from the classroom out is a really useful way to grow change. Finally, as I noted before, I think action research is about working collegially. It's about working in a community for a shared sort of investigation. I can't see people doing it in a solo way. And even if you're a solo researcher, you've still got to say, well, who's involved? Are you working with teaching colleagues? Are you working with students? At least students will always be affected if it's about teaching and learning. Maybe the community, parents. And so these people have to be included and as part of the project. It doesn't mean they're all working as researchers in the same way, but they are part of the action research process. And so therefore you need to work collegially and collaboratively, and sometimes that's hard work because you can't just run a solo sort of endeavour here. I've just got an example here. This is based on when we tried to do some work actually in my own school context when I was a teacher. It was about building engagement in secondary maths classrooms. Now, you might find this hard to believe, but the students in our school weren't necessarily that excited about mathematics. And while they often were doing okay, a lot of students were dropping out or taking lower levels of maths than they could, and they really didn't like it very much. So we thought we needed to try and build some engagement in maths. So what we did first of all, if you can see here where it says step 1, we found an activity appropriate for our classes. And then what we did is, as a group of teachers, we sat down together and did the activity ourselves. And then we looked down at what we thought were the features of our solution, and we also noted down what we found about doing the maths ourselves. Interestingly, for a group of mathematics teachers, it was the first time we'd done mathematics for a long time. We found we quite enjoyed it, but it was quite funny that we were, in some ways, resorted to the same sort of behaviours you see in classroom, where we were being a bit secretive and we were scared to show other people what we did. Nevertheless, we did it and it was good for us, and from what we found, we then went on to the second cycle. Notice we didn't plan the second cycle till we'd done the first cycle. So in the second cycle, we then took that activity and built it into the next unit of our work for our Year 10 mathematics classes. The students all then did it as part of their unit when it came up, and the teachers each collected some work samples from some of the students, and we also observed, one teacher went and observed each teacher when this activity was being done for about 20 minutes. And what we found was the students were engaged in the class, and the work samples indicated there was more emphasis on making that we needed to be more obvious about making the mathematics more observed. The kids liked it, but they didn't think they were learning any maths. So we did the next cycle, the third one. We found another new activity, and we included it in the next unit, one that was more problem solving and activity based. The students completed the activity again, and again we collected work samples and we observed one another. Again, we found the students were engaged in the task and activity, and this time because we made the mathematics more overt, so rather than just doing an activity, we linked it quite overtly to the maths curriculum. Then the students were more clear about what they were learning. In this case, it happened to be about algebra. And so from there we went on to the fourth one, and in the fourth cycle, we wanted to find out what the students thought. So again, you can see here they were the participants in the project, even though they weren't involved in the everyday run-of-the-mill part of the action research. And we got the students to complete a simple survey. The survey responses were collated by the group leader, which was myself. And then what we found from that was the students liked the activities, but they just didn't think they were learning very much, and they were worried about their exams. So when we went on to the next cycle, we put another activity in, and then what we did was we made the mathematics overt again, and then we linked it really clearly to an exam type question, so they could see how what they'd learned through the activity and the reflection on that activity lent to their performance on formal assessment tasks. And so it went on. Now that's just one simple example. Here I'm sure you're keeping it tight to time, but there's many others we could do. If you're really interested, and then I suggest this is a really useful book to use. It's written by Stephen Kemmis, Robin McTaggart and Rhonda Nixon. Stephen Kemmis wrote a very good book with Wilfred Carr called Becoming Critical, which is the foundation of action research. And if you're going to do action research as part of a master's or doctoral thesis program, you'd have to read that book. But this book here is really useful in terms of it gives a good theoretical foundation, and then it gives lots of practical examples and tips, including some from real educational settings that might be useful if you're going to pursue it. I'm sure it's in the library. So, thanks for listening. Hope it was useful. There's my email address if you need to find it anymore. All the best.